UX Podcast is funded by me and Per, together with contributions we get from you, our listeners. Help support UX Podcast and the UX community by contributing financially to keep the show running. Visit uxpodcast.com/support and contribute as much as you can.
UX Podcast episode 243.
Hello, I'm Pat Axbom.
And I'm James Roy Lawson.
And this is UX Podcast. We're in Stockholm, Sweden, and you're listening in 194 countries all over the world, from Palestine to Denmark.
From time to time, we bring you a repeat show. This is an episode from our extensive back catalogue, resurfacing some of the ideas and thoughts from the past that we believe are still relevant and well worth revisiting.
Caroline Jarrett, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Where are you located at right now?
I'm in a little town called Leighton Buzzard, which is just like the bird, Buzzard.
You've got to love British place names. They're driving around the UK. Driving around the UK, it's fantastic. Just looking at all the signs. There's some great Swedish ones as well, to be honest. But you've got to understand Swedish to get the most benefit from them.
But the pronunciation isn't always obvious either.
Well, as you probably know, I'm a form specialist, and whenever I encounter a US website that insists I put on a US state, I always choose Arkansas, because it seems to me that a town called Buzzard would be in Arkansas. Of course, and Arkansas is at the top of the alphabet as well. And the UK Post Office really doesn't seem to mind if the address has a random AR for Arkansas in it. No. And then I complain about that to my American friends, and they point out that British sites are just as pedantic about forcing them to put in UK postcodes. So it's a classic internationalisation problem.
You're right. It's exactly the same thing with Swedish sites that go international, and the whole way postcodes are split up.
I always choose Michigan because I have friends there.
Exactly.
So we all have our little techniques and patterns that we follow when we're doing this this kind of stuff.
Right. But that is a perfect segue into why we are having you on the show, Caroline, is because you are a forms and survey specialist, and you've been working with forms. I don't know. I found somewhere it said for 15 years or something.
No, 20
years.
More than 20. I started I just had the 20th birthday of Effort Mark Limited last month. Yeah. And I'd been specialising in forms before I actually started the business. So more than 20 years of being completely overexcited and interested in forms.
Oh.
Yeah.
So your background is you've even been working with, or you work with non-digital forms as well then?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I date back, when I started, dinosaurs roamed the earth and we didn't have any internet. So to be honest, I actually started in computer systems. So before I got into what we called human-computer interaction in those days, it keeps changing its name. I keep doing the same stuff, but it keeps changing name. I was a project manager, software engineer, and a project manager in computer systems. So a lot of my work, the reason I got into forms was that I was a project manager delivering optical character recognition systems to the Inland Revenue, as it was called at that time.
Yeah.
And
the tax authority. Yeah.
The tax authorities, yes. They wanted to scan tax forms, obviously to save typing. And the sad part was that the systems really didn't work at all well. And I got permission to go and find out what was actually happening in the various tax offices. And I discovered that the forms were filled in extremely badly. So there was no way that my computer system was ever going to deal with a form where someone had written, "Please read attached letter." It just wasn't going to happen. So I then became really interested in, how do we design the forms so that they're filled in accurately, because then my computer system would work. And I just became completely interested in how do you make forms easy to fill in. And there you go. As I say, it's a fascination that shows no signs of wearing off.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
No, it's when you mention one of my first jobs that I did in that bit after university was data entry for British Gas. When they used to come with these piles of completed work orders, I guess, and when the engineers had been out and done things for people's gas meters and so on, and that was just the things you got back on these pieces of paper was just crazy, and you sat there you had to fill them all into the system. So straight away you see that problem of humans, paper, data entry.
And these days, I still completely recommend work observation to people. Go and watch people actually deal with the stuff, and you'll learn an enormous amount. And in particular, I love a post room. I love going to visit the post room, and will indeed get up at 5 a.m. because a lot of large organisations like to open their post at times like 6 a.m. so that all the workers have the piles of post ready and waiting for them. And you meet interesting, nice people in the post room, and you learn an awful lot about how forms actually arrive and what they really look like. Again, there's a great story. Back in the day, the revenue was thinking about using scanning for all their post, and went to the post room, and there was amazing things turned up in the post. For example, a box of uniforms arrived. I was like, how are you going to scan the uniforms exactly? So the rule was that if a uniform had to be inspected by a tax officer to assess whether it was purely a uniform and therefore could not be used as normal clothing, because if you could wear the uniform as everyday clothing, then it was a taxable benefit.
Oh.
Just great.
Great. Fantastic. Yeah.
But, so paper, computer systems, and then the internet came along and web forms, and that was really cool because you could get people to type stuff in on their computer rather than having people type it in for them, and so much more efficient and wonderful, and so many new and interesting and exciting ways for people to mess up their forms, which they carry on doing, to this day.
And of course, best case scenario, I mean, you can always, if you find that the form isn't working, you can change it much faster than if you have 1,000 copies of it.
Absolutely. And you can also make an awful lot of people really upset because there's no way that they can write on the edge of the form, I don't know what button to click. Just today, today I tweeted an example where I happened to have a small problem with my foot, and I went to see the podiatrist, as they call the foot doctor, and he said, well, you need these special type of insoles, and he gave me a pair, and they're great. And he said, order some spares. So I went onto a website to order some spares, and it gave me 2 buttons to click, neither of which applied to me. What did I do? I need to buy the stuff. I need to get them from the manufacturer. The choice was, are you a private practitioner or another type of practitioner? And there was no button or anything to do if you were just a normal person. And I was stuck. So,
I suppose you could stretch it to other. Yeah,
there was nothing. And I rang them up, and they said, oh, yes, we have a completely different website for the general public. And I just thought, well, it would save you a lot of time and trouble if you had put that information on the Contact Us page or indeed on the registration page.
That's something that happened, and I remember I think it was last year I ordered some timers, so children's timers, these kind of big colourful timers you have at schools to kind of say, you've got 5 minutes left and then turn it over. And the website I bought them from, it was really hard work ordering, and I kind of thought, this just feels really odd and wrong. And then it took absolute age for the things to come. I think it took like 4 or 5 weeks, and I kept ringing up and I kept getting real nice people apologising to me and saying, I'm really sorry it's taking so long. I mean, they've just missed your order again. Something's not right. So eventually I got to speak to the director of this company, and he explained to me that basically I was pretty much the first private person who'd ordered anything from their company website. Previously they'd been education only selling to schools. And what, as it turned out, was that their stock room guys and the system, how the system was built, just wasn't at all prepared for this other channel in. that private people could order it. So they were prioritising these bulk orders for all the schools and leaving all the private individuals with kind of only wanting one or two in a pile. And just kind of, we'll do that when the next lot of orders, next lot of supply comes in. So it was just never getting fulfilled. But there's none of this was apparent to me I just looked like a normal website with a few quirks. You can tell these kind of things when you work in the business. You just feel the force says this isn't going to work well. But you do it anyway.
It's such a great story because it just goes to show that some of the old-fashioned techniques that I used in the 1980s of going and observing people working are still important. Even though we think it's all internet, in the end, an awful lot of this is actually comes down to people in a warehouse or, going and watching them work can tell you an enormous amount. We often need to get out of our offices and meet the people who are doing the real work. Yeah. And then that can make life so much more efficient. And these days, of course, I've been doing that forever, but these days it tends to be called something like journey mapping or touch point analysis or pain points, or people keep changing the terms, but it's still just down to basic common sense, watching people work and having a think about it.
It is, isn't it? I love that what you said before, that I keep doing the same stuff, but it just changes its name. And it is really, really true.
Didn't it used to be called, was it time and motion studies?
Exactly.
Back in many decades ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually gave a talk on that recently.
Recently?
Where I used that example, motion study with Taylor and the Gilbreths. The book and the film, where they have a dozen children. That's actually based on the couple that started time studies back in the Taylor days. And he had an example where he was observing bricklayers, and the bricklayers were bending down each time to grab a brick and put it on the wall. And he invented something something that would hold the bricks for him, that he didn't have to bend down. And they saved like 80% of time based on the motion studies and what he came up with. And just observing patients in a room, or during an operation, observing a doctor during an operation, they were the couple that actually determined that, oh my God, this doctor needs to ask for the instruments from a nurse, so it doesn't have to walk back and forth to the table and get those instruments. And those people, based on those observations, are the reason why operations are performed in that way today. That is pretty cool, actually.
It is.
It's great.
So we all do nothing but optimize. We're just constantly optimizing everything we do. We call it design, don't we? But we're optimizing.
Well, there's that, and that's us as designers, I guess. But what happens is that the people tend to satisfy rather than optimize. That they'll do what they can to get through the day. So the person that was observed picking up the book, that was a satisficing. It was because that person needed to get that job done and was just muddling through. And we see that behaviour all the time of people simply muddling through situations, and then they get used to it. So this is another reason why we have to do the observation, because they forget, they just do the work that they do. They don't have to recall it or think about it or do anything other than do their jobs. So going and observing them. But it's interesting that we're talking about some of the historic research, because one of the things that's absolutely fascinating me about the field of surveys is that it's a field with a tremendously long literature. So one of the most cited and actually most interesting papers in the world of survey methodology is the famous Rensis-Likert paper from 1932, which is the one that talks about what's now known as Likert scales or Likert response formats, and there's an interestingly fine distinction between those two.
Oh, I've always pronounced that Likert. Now I hear what you're saying. Yes.
I believe that Mr. Likert called it Likert, but I shall just have to double check.
You're probably right. I probably just read it everywhere and I just pronounced it Likert scale.
Right.
One of the problems we have been speaking lots and lots of English in Sweden, but not always having English-speaking input. We sometimes just make them up.
Well, and who can say how a name is pronounced in English until you ask the person themselves? You have no chance, really. So that just goes to show, there's been surveys going for a long time. And I got into the whole world of surveys because I was looking for what research had been done in forms, and discovered that consistently, people really haven't researched forms. They've just assumed, I don't know why they don't research them, but they don't. But the survey methodologists have done enormous amounts of research and continue to do so. So practically every country, I mean, there are 190 odd different national statistical institutes listed on the United Nations website, for example. Virtually every country in the world has a central statistical authority. Majority of official statistics arise from surveys. So this survey methodology going on at a national, international level has been for decades, centuries even. Enormous amount of interesting literature, a lot of which is about how do people answer questions, how they think about questions, how to get better answers to questions. So all of that's very interesting for forms. And that's kind of how I got into surveys, sort of by accident, really, because that was where I could find insights for my forms work. But recently I've become more and more interested in surveys too, and that's what I'm mostly doing in workshops at the moment, is survey workshops. Just come back from doing one at UXLEX. The slides are on my SlideShare account. And I'm just preparing one for the User Experience Professionals Conference, which is in less than a month now in London.
Right. So that's you're at UXLX, which is the first year in many years that we haven't been there. So you have to tell us how that experience was as well, going there and giving that talk, and how people appreciated the talk that you gave in the workshop.
It's a great conference, you know. If you've been, you know, it's the most international conference that I've been to. I was lucky enough to go and do a talk on forms at the first one in 2010.
Right.
So it was a real pleasure to be invited back to do something on surveys at the most recent one. Had about, I guess, 25 people in my workshop, and probably representing at least a dozen countries.
Oh, excellent.
Which was great. And we had a good productive time, I think. So we were doing a bit of a deep dive into questions, looking first of all at the 4-step model for answering questions, and then we had a good look at asking about satisfaction and the post-task satisfaction questionnaires.
I've got the presentation in front of me now, so I'm going to cheat and read them. Read and understand, find the answer, judge the answer, and place the answer.
Correct.
Yeah.
Want me to elaborate?
No, absolutely, because I think I would have come to the workshop if I'd been there, because I think this is, it's a fascinating subject, because when we're doing UX research, we're constantly asking questions. We're constantly placing questions, or we're asking for, like you said, the post-task or post-test questionnaires, system usability scales or whatever it is. We're constantly throwing questions at people with scales here and there, and net promoter scores. And when you start digging into it, there's so many little things, so many details. Just like with everything else we do, it's all about the detail and understanding what you're doing.
So it is actually easy for us to understand how you can get passionate about forms. Although when I have given talks about specific web forms and I try to pitch it to my client, the first thing that comes out of the mouth is that sounds really, really boring. And forms tend to have an effect on people. Just forms, that's boring. If we get back to the 4 steps that you just read there, James, is that read and understand, find an answer. The one that really caught my eye when I was looking at the presentation was judge the answer, because I wouldn't have picked that out just thinking about it. So guide us through those steps, Caroline. What do they really mean?
Well, I think, read and understand is pretty obvious. If you can't read the question, if it's illegible, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't try and answer it. So finding an answer, some questions we do have answers just in our heads, So you just asked me a question and I know this stuff pretty well, so I have the answer directly in my head. If you wanted to find an explanation, you would possibly have to go and read something or look it up or hunt for it. So one of the classic examples I give on finding an answer is when you pay for something using a credit card. Now, some people are very good with numbers and have memorized the long number on their credit card. I'm very bad with numbers, and I have to read the number off the card. I have to have the physical card in front of me, and I have to copy it digit by digit. So I have to find an answer. I have to look at something else to have an answer to that. Judging the answer is something that we generally are fairly happy to reveal answers to people. But if you think about privacy, that a lot of us, I don't want to shock you, but many people actually have a completely false set of information that they use on the internet. I know you can't credit it, can you? Obviously, majority of people always give exactly their precise, correct and accurate personal details on all occasions. But there is this behaviour which I've heard of where people may not always wish to reveal that to everybody. And that's where they're judging the answer. They're deciding, is this an answer I actually want to tell someone? On some websites I've seen which have been thoughtfully designed against email address, they may have a link to click to say, how will you use your email address? Which for people who are sensitive about privacy might be the difference between revealing their actual email address or making one up. So that's the judging part. Do people actually want to give you this answer, and are they willing to give you the correct information? And then the placing the answer thing is exactly that problem I was just talking about, where I had an answer for that website, which is to say I want to purchase as a private individual, but the only options they gave me was, which type of doctor are you? There was no place for me to tell them, I'm not a doctor, I'm just an individual person. So it's extremely common for there to be fewer choices in the mind of an organisation than there are in real life.
So another example maybe would be male, female, or none of your business.
Yeah. And indeed the Australian government has official Australian government policy is male, female or other. So some people are quite happy to tell you what their gender is, but it's neither male nor female.
Of course, and some people can be offended by just having the other box to check, because there are, I think Facebook has 23 different genders that you can select.
Excellent, yeah.
Right.
You're in the middle of a sex change, you're had a sex change, you're a transvestite. Yeah, there's a lot.
And why should you reveal all those details, But it just goes to show there's very few questions where there are only exactly the sort of answers that I call it the answers in the official mind and may not match up the answers in the main real world. And I find that 4-step framework is a very powerful way of looking at questions in general. It comes out of the world of survey methodology, which is, shows how the two fields can be usefully inform each other, really. We did a lot of digging into that at the UXLEX. For the one coming up in London, it's a workshop that's specifically aimed at experienced practitioners. Okay. So I'm really taking the opportunity to kind of max it out with the challenge and hit people with some fairly challenging or difficult concepts and seeing how they fly.
Have you got an example of one? You've got to give an example now of a difficult concept. That sounds great.
An example of difficult concept. Well, the really interesting concept is the concept of total survey error. So the survey methodologists do not think just about sampling error or statistical significance. So one of the things people say is, well, how many people do I have to survey in order to achieve statistical significance? Which is sort of worth asking, but no matter how many people you ask a question of, if it's a stupid question, you won't achieve real significance. You can achieve practical significance, but with uninteresting answers. So total survey error is about looking at your overall costs, both actual costs in terms of how many people you ask and how much data you're going to have to process, and cognitive costs, as in how much burden are you putting on the population that you're surveying. Is that worthwhile? Should you be asking fewer questions of fewer people? To which the answer is nearly always yes.
You're trying to balance the pain of doing the stuff with the value of doing it.
Right. And looking at things like coverage error. So you could get 50,000 responses. Is that good or bad? Is 50,000 a good representation of the population you're trying to survey or not? So, for example, 50,000 responses generated by people who are on Twitter would not be a good representation of, for example, the UK population, because only a small minority of us are on Twitter.
I got a new car this year. Well, I got rung up a couple of times by the car company to ask how the whole experience was. I mean, I'm used to them doing that because I've had a car from them before. But this time I got a new car survey, and I didn't fill it in. The reason I didn't fill it in is because, if memory serves me right, it was about 30 pages. and I flick through it, and I'm just looking and thinking, my God, I mean, it's all in Swedish as well. I'm thinking, God, how long is it going to take me? What am I going to do? And there's like pictures of cars. He's asking me to tell what I think about this bit, that bit, how it is to drive, how it is to buy, what I thought about it before. There was just endless number of questions. There was nothing not in this survey, and I said I didn't fill it in, and I normally do quite like filling in surveys. There's a bit of me that enjoys it, but now I'm reflecting on it and thinking with what you've just said, Caroline, that the people who do bother to fill that survey in, they can't possibly be representative, because who in their right mind is going to fill in that survey with no reward or anything? I mean, it's just for pure joy. I'll have to see if I still got it, and I might even send you it, Caroline, because it's even though it's in Swedish, I think you'd like it.
Well, that's an interesting example, because that's another type of error that comes into total survey error. That's an error called non-response error. So another sort of error you have to think about is, even if you've sent your survey to a good random sample that does directly represent the population of interest, if you've got a situation where the people who don't respond differ from the people who do respond in some way that matters to your survey, then you've got non-response error.
Yeah.
Okay? And you can see how your sampling is not going to help that. Taking a better sample will not solve non-response error. And you're addressing the problem there, where you're saying, well, actually, I think only people who are particularly boring will answer this survey, and do they really want to infer the general population characteristics just on people who are completely obsessed and boring?
Yeah.
Maybe they do. Maybe that's fine.
Exactly. Or every single person with 2 kids and everyone full-time jobs who doesn't have anywhere near enough time to fill in the 30-page survey are not going to respond. So then you end up cutting out an entire segment.
But you did touch upon something else there also, James. You said something, and there wasn't even a reward. And that's something I wanted to talk about a bit, is what if there was a reward? And given that there were also 30 pages and you had 500 questions with the Likert scale, with your strongly disagree to strongly agree. And in the end, having filled out a lot of those types of surveys, I realized that as I get further and further into it, I'm getting more and more tired, and I'm not really concentrating on the answers. And I realized, well, I'm just checking, I'm sort of agreeing with the questions, because I sort of know, half expect what the questions are going to be. And so I'm guessing that the reward, if I want the reward enough, I'm going to complete the survey, but I may not really be truthful in my answers or give them enough thought for them to be representative of what I really feel.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a phenomenon of people's level of interest can decline. And really, it's also a question there of putting too much burden on the respondent. So you can persuade people to answer for longer by giving them a better reward, but you can't stop them getting bored if you bore them, and
that's perfect. I love that.
a lot of surveys and market research have not moved on conceptually, I think, from, if you go back to the 1950s or before, collecting answers to a survey meant sending out someone with a survey as an interviewer and getting them to sit down with someone, and they would have a conversation and write down all the answers. Well, that's a very expensive collection procedure. So once you've decided to do that, you really want to wring every last possible shred of opinion out of the person you're interviewing. And in those days, I'm assuming surveys were possibly a nice novel interruption into the humdrum level of everyday life, possibly. Or maybe people were just very busy, but because surveys were few and far between, there was a level of novelty.
You felt special, maybe. I mean, I remember.
Yeah, you felt special.
Yeah, when those days when someone rang up and said, "Do you mind if we come round and talk to you about, I don't know, radio listenership behaviour or something?" When they come round and talk to you about BBC Radio and things, it was quite interesting. It felt like you were important, you were valued, because it was unusual.
Right. And you were, and you still ought to feel important and valued and unusual.
Exactly.
But when it's done in a very impersonal way, and when it's one of the many different things that compete for your attention in a very busy information stream that's being hosed at us, and when it's possible to reach far more people far more easily, then I think we should get over asking people quite so many questions. These days, I think we can do what I call patchworking, which is my own name for it, which is instead of asking 500 people 50 pages of questions, you could ask 100 people 5 questions, and another 100 people a different 5 questions, and another 100 people a different 5 questions, possibly with 1 or 2 questions that are common, and build up a sort of patchwork quilt picture of your data, which sounds much more laborious, and it sounds as if it wouldn't be representative, but it's much more likely to be representative than asking 2 or 3 people who've got loads of time on their hands and maybe completely unrepresentative of population, everything. Yeah. It would be better to get little bits of very representative data and make a sort of mosaic or patchwork picture that is a good picture than have very large amounts of very unrepresentative data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yes, it does.
And I think it's an absolute excellent
I've never
idea.
heard of it before.
No, it's an excellent idea. I was just thinking as well that, so often now we see, the layer comes up on the website in the middle of you doing something else, which is your actual task on the website, and asks you, do you have a few minutes of your time to answer some questions about our website? And straight away there, right, you're distracted, you're irritated, and you've got to click yes or no. But that in itself, using the patchwork method that you described now, Caroline, that itself could be a question. So if you're going to get them to do one click, you might as well ask them the question straight off and get them to click there on that one.
And also, if you can try and build some confidence in the population, what we're doing at the moment is, I think organisations are systematically training their customers to ignore them. For example, hey, let's name and shame. British Telecom, great big major telecom supplier in the UK. Yeah. I did a small study, a qualitative study of survey response a couple of summers ago, and a friend of mine was very kind and kept records of every survey she filled in for a month, and she was having a couple of problems with her telephone at the time. Ooh. And the first time she contacted customer support at BT, they sent her a "How was this for you?" survey, and she filled it in. And the problem wasn't resolved, and the second time she contacted them, they sent her the same survey. And she filled it in, but she wasn't really happy about it. And by the third time she contacted them and they sent her the same survey, she decided never to answer their surveys ever again.
Of course.
So in the course of a month, they trained her to be a completely dedicated non-respondent. And I think many organisations are doing that to their customers by asking them too often.
We only scratched the surface, really, because we haven't talked about, how sensitive a topic is it we're asking about, how do we formulate the questions, stuff like that. How do we make people understand what the question is and what type of response we're really expecting. Even legibility, I know that you've talked about that in your workshop as well, Caroline. The typeface, the font, how legible it is. Is it black and white, or are you using colors that distract the user? There are so many aspects of online forms that it's just mind blowing.
Yeah, I was thinking about the old the question bias as well. How you knowingly or unknowingly write biased questions. I've got an example about that as well.
So there you go. You see, I detect a little bit of forms passion coming through there. I can feel the infection spreading out. Be careful, because if it hits you bad, you might be stuck with it for the next 20 years.
I think we probably will invite you back on again at some point in the future, Caroline, because I can tell we could fill up definitely more than one show with content we're talking with you.
That would be terrific.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks,
You're
Caroline.
welcome.
Thank you. This podcast has been a repeat show from our archives. Let us know which of your favourite episodes of the years you think should be repeated for more people to listen to.
And if you'd like to contribute to funding UX Podcast, then visit uxpodcast.com/support. Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side. So, Pat, I've done a survey asking people what make of shampoo they use in the shower.
Okay.
Yeah, 99% of them answered, "What the hell are you doing in here? Get out!" And now I bet you're wondering about the 1%, aren't you?
Oh.